This is a small patch numerically, but relative to what's actually happening in it, could be one of the bigger patches in Marvel Snap. First up, Iron Patriot is taking a nerf to the amount of discount that he gives. Iron Patriot will now only discount the card you get by 3 instead of by 4. This removes a lot of his true explosiveness, a lot of those free 4-cost cards that people were able to get, and makes it a little bit less oppressive when your opponent is able to trigger that Iron Patriot, a little bit less of a snap condition in a vacuum, and a little bit more of a snap condition depending on if the card you got was actually good. I think that's probably a good thing for Iron Patriot as a whole. It brings him closer to cards like Valentina, which pull from a smaller pool, but also have a much more limiting effect on the card that you pull. I do think that Iron Patriot will likely end up being still a very viable metagame player. I suspect that because of his specific role at the 2-drop spot, where he's still just better than a lot of other 2s, he's still going to be in a lot of stuff. But this does put him firmly behind his Season Pass cohort Sam Wilson, in my humble opinion. I also think that Iron Patriot is a card that a lot of people had a sort of viscerally negative experience with. And what I mean by that is, this is a card that has the Arishem problem of, they generated the perfect Iron Patriot card, I didn't play around them having an Arnim Zola for their Shang-Chi, guess I just lose. It makes that stuff meaningfully harder, but still possible. And I think that that's generally the right space for this card to be in. Bluntly, I feel like Iron Patriot with this effect is going to be still very good, but like a balanced version of very good. It's possible that he still ends up on play rate looking like a nerfable card, and I think this is going to be one of those nerfs that a lot of people are just not going to feel. People are going to look at this nerf and be like, they didn't do enough, but then when they actually play against the card, they're going to win like 5% of the time more, which really matters. Like, that is a marginal change that impacts large sample sizes. So on a game-to-game basis, I don't really expect this to feel different. Like, you still see people complaining about Arishem, even though it's like way worse. You still see that level of complaint because the play pattern feels the same, even though it is, on balance, significantly worse. Arishem's a much more balanced card right now. I think Iron Patriot's going to see a lot of that. Basically, I just hit the mic. I expect Second Dinner to get a lot of flack for making an unfelt nerf here. I think people are going to look at this and be like, that's not enough, it's ridiculous. And I think it is enough, and it's probably the right thing to do. Iron Patriot is pretty much fine here, is my personal suspicion. On the other hand, there is in Marvel Snap a very clear lack of generic good 2s, or I should say generic great 2s. This brings Iron Patriot more in line with Jeff, but it doesn't really put it in line with Jeff. This brings Iron Patriot more in line with Kate Bishop, but it doesn't really put it in line with Kate Bishop. In other words, Iron Patriot is going from probably the second best generic 2-drop in the game. I'm not counting things like Scream here or whatever that are like for a specific deck, but just like in terms of the mid-range pile, it's going from probably the second best to definitely the second best. And so it's a nerf to the actual card without changing its relative position and role in the metagame. To me, that means this is a great change. It's a free, effectively a free change. They get to just do this without having anyone be like, oh man, you bait and switched me. I bought Iron Patriot and now it's not gonna be what I bought it for. Because it's going to be the exact same card in terms of metagame role. It's just going to be like a little bit worse at doing the thing that it does. But I don't really expect to see people running Jeff anytime soon instead of this guy. Iron Patriot, I definitely do expect to stick around unless this ends up being like a massive limiter. I think that on the whole, what this will do is alleviate some of the pressure that he puts on you mentally when you play against him and you feel like, oh my god, I just instantly lost the game on turn 2, because that will be less true, and it will make more demands of your opponent to actually use the card that they get, because cards generally are better when there's some friction involved. Having a 0-cost card is pretty much frictionless. So adding a little bit of friction to every Iron Patriot is an important thing to do, And notably, there's going to be some situations where that really, really matters, like situations like, oh, the location that prevents you from playing 4, 5, and 6s in there. Iron Patriot could get around that with a 0 cost card that was originally a 4, things like that. Now he won't be able to do that. I just generally expect him to be notably weaker, but not necessarily feel weaker, which feels like this is a free move for them. On the subject of free roll nerfs, since December, I think it's been pretty clear on and off that Galacta could lose a point of power and would still go in all the decks that she already goes in, which means that I think it's very safe for them to take a point of power off here. I don't think this is a super meaningful, like, oh my god, we've caused Galacta pain. But it especially matters in a world where people are images of iconing this card. Going to 18 is meaningfully different than going to 15, for example. That does matter. I also think that, like, if they really wanted to hurt Galacta, if they really wanted to make every deck that currently played Galacta take a second look at if they should continue playing Galacta, they could put it at 4-4. I think at 4-5, it leaves her in this middle ground of she could go either way. I lean towards her still being a fairly generic inclusion, but I do think that this meaningfully hurts her a little bit, and much like with Iron Patriot, it feels like this is probably just the right place for her to be at right now. The images of icon interaction is a notable, unpleasant one, and dinging that just a little bit, I think, is solid. I want to address the idea that it's impossible for them to make a card with +3 on it. I think that comes up a lot. And, barring Red Hulk, I think, which is pretty clearly fine to have it +3. Galacta is, in my opinion, still a good argument that this is fine. I think that ultimately the thing that made her strong was not that she said +3, but that she was a reasonable body that also did this thing. This at 4-6 is just like, oh, you play me on 4, I'm a 4-12, it's going to be fine. Going to 4-11 does matter. Spreading that power across is better than being Shang-Chi-able, of course, but I do think that at 4-11, that promise is still there. The multiplication of her effect with images of icon, the fact that she still goes in every Surfer deck, all of that, I think, is very clear to me. Like, if you're playing Surfer, you're still playing this. If you're playing Agamotto, you're still playing this. She's going to be in a lot of the decks she's already in. And I think the fact that they can take a point of power off of her, and I doubt that she will see a hugely meaningful reduction in her play rate, that is probably a really good argument for taking a point of power off of her. I think that this does give the other 4s a little bit more room to breathe. It's sort of very clear when you look at Galacta and Gwenpool which one of those is better when both of them are 4-6, especially things like Wiccan, similar comparisons. Which one of these is better? Which one of these am I putting effort into? How much am I generally getting out of that extra energy versus the 3 power I would be getting out of Galacta? I do think that it's very likely that Galacta ends up still good, but I also think you're probably going to want to be building more towards what she actually does. Luckily for her, there is a lot of a high volume of good cards that already want to do what she does. Even something like a Captain Marvel, any deck with rocketing Groot, that kind of stuff, it's already what she wants to be doing. You don't need to over-invest in Galacta, like with stuff like Brood, to make her worth running, even at 4-5. You just have to have a little bit of a bonus for that, like a Kitty Pryde or a Rocketing Groot, something to make sure that you're getting the maximum impact out of her buff in whatever way you can, either by multiplying the buff or making sure that it's always going to be at the location you want it to be, or by being a Juggernaut gamer so you can use the buffs on the locations where they matter and then Juggernaut the other lane. That is sort of generally what I still expect her to be able to do. I will also note that at this point, I'm really starting to look at Arishem and say, I kind of think that deck really needs a buff now, because it got Doom 2099 nuked, and then nuked again, and now Galacta's been nuked, and a lot of the premise, not nuked, she's still probably good in the deck, but the premise of the deck has been, 2 into 4, emphasize the 4-on-3 jump, and it's getting less valuable to emphasize that 4-on-3 jump. And it's not the kind of deck that actually has replacements for these cards, because like a Gwenpool is notably worse in Arishem than it is in various other places, because a lot of the cards Gwenpool is going to hit are just not good anyway. And so you have this void of 4s that was like, it felt like to me like that was maybe the impetus for why they changed Arishem, is they were making a bunch of good 4s, and now those 4s are like notably less good. And I do think that matters for a deck like that is so premised on exploiting that energy gap. On the whole, I think Galacta, much like Iron Patriot, will see a similar amount of play, but just be weaker. And I think that is undeniably a win. My favorite change in this entire patch is Sauron going to 2/2. This just rocks. I remember seeing Sauron going to 3/4, and I'm like, well, that won't do anything. That doesn't really solve the problem. Either you make him a 3/5 or you make him a 2-drop. They made him a 2-drop. And this is really cool, especially in the context of the recently released Star brand, because it now gives you some real incentive to actually play this deck. Sauron is a really interesting deck, and Sauron being a 3 with such high levels of competition at 3 is really, really bad for the deck. So basically what this does is allow you to use a much less valuable deck slot on a card that you absolutely want to be playing all of the time. So instead of giving up the ability to play a Rocket and Groot, a Gladiator, a Copycat, to play your Sauron, you're only giving up the ability to play, say, a Sam Wilson, which you probably wouldn't be playing in your Sauron deck anyway. It does kind of embarrass you a little bit when your opponent's playing a Sam Wilson, you're doing this. It's not great. Like, 2/2 is not a great stat line still. It's been a while since we've had any good 2/2s. I have some hope for this, but I do think that, like, what matters most with cards like this where you're, like, setting up is the premise of a card like this is you play this on 2, they play a scalar on 2, but you're also using this as a scalar because it's like, you know, this is 6 points with Star Brand, this is who knows how many points with Typhoid Mary, this is 1 billion points with your various Red Skull thing. But what this really does, I think, is potentially open up a world where you get to play this in a Surtur deck. And I think that's really interesting. Getting to play Star Brand in your Surtur deck with no downside. Getting to play Typhoid Mary in your Surtur deck with no downside. That's the kind of stuff that I think could really make this legit. And so you have a change like this that is, on its face, maybe not a buff to Sauron specifically, but it allows you to do other stuff in a Sauron deck. Like, Sauron Surtur is now suddenly extremely compelling to me because that deck lost Cull Obsidian. Not lost, but like kind of lost it with the Sam interaction. You're no longer free rolling the Cull Obsidian. Maybe there's a world in which we are able to get that back with a Typhoid Mary that has been Sauron. Just on a personal note, one of my favorite comic pages of all time is the "but I want to turn people into dinosaurs, I don't want to cure cancer" Sauron page. I got this guy basically immediately when he came out. I want him to be good. I do worry if anything does hold him back, it would be the general lower power level of his archetype. Hopefully fusing with Surtur can help alleviate that a little bit, but it might still be too inconsistent. And of course, if anything else holds him back, it's the fact that he's a 2/2, and I think we've seen at this point that it's actually okay to put 2/3 stats on a card like this. And I think that this card being 2/3 would demonstrate like a real commitment to, like, that's probably where this card is supposed to be. And I understand why they wouldn't want to risk that, especially in a world where they just nerfed Surtur 8 million times and they're now kind of worried that, like, maybe this makes Surtur good again. I get why they would be like, no, you got to play a 2/2 if you want to try to do this. We're going to actually punish you, especially because Surtur is a deck that really wants to be out ahead of stuff for things like Crossbones. And so you have this deck where it's like, okay, I understand what you're doing. I think this is a sort of sneaky way of making Sauron a legitimate card, and not making him a 2/3 is them saying, we really don't want to go overboard with this and guarantee that, like, Surtur Sauron is actually going to be legit. But if anything in this patch spawns a new archetype, I think it will be this. Pixie is gaining a point of power, which I think is long overdue, but I also think doesn't really alleviate the issues with the card. My instinct is that Pixie could be a 1-1 maybe, or even up to a 2-3. I think the issue with Pixie is that when Pixie is good, it is almost always predicated on Mobius being good, which good spot for it to be in right now. I mean, it would have been better like a month ago when Iron Patriot was giving -4 and you'd really have a reason to like be the anti-Iron Patriot Mobius deck, but I'm not going to sit here and complain about a buff that I frankly have been asking for like 6 months, right? Like I've been on the Pixie could get buff train for a while now, in part because I think Mobius on his own is so weak and has so few synergies that it's hard to get him into a deck that is able to compensate for his lack of power and has a meaningful dream attached to it. Last time we saw this was like before the Doom 2099 nerfs. We had like the ongoing wide 2099 Spectrum deck. That was a deck that could afford to play Mobius and make up for it later. Pixie decks were not able to do that with 2-1. It gets a little iffy. With 2-2, it's more possible, but not necessarily extremely possible. Again, this is a space where it's like, I think they could have gone to 2-3, but if they go to 2-3, that might be too heavy of a hand. All of that is to say, I think that Pixie is a card that actually plays a pretty important role in being a metagame police card, in the sense that it gives you a proactive reason to run a Mobius and Mobius, and in the sense that it's self-solving, meaning that if a bunch of people are playing Pixie and Mobius, well, they're playing Mobius into each other's Mobiuses, so they eventually just say, oh, I'm going to go find a different avenue to attack because it's not very fruitful to do that. So this is a self-solving card, in my opinion, a lot of the time, which means it feels like it's a safer place to put power than I think they think that it is. It's possible that they just don't like Mobius being all that good. Like, that's a reasonable opinion to have. We had Binks on my channel talking about how much he hates that card existing, how much it, like, limits the ability of, like, any off-meta stuff to succeed, because many off-meta decks are just trying to find weird ways to cheat energy that are like not necessarily the ways that are like the meta ways to cheat energy. And so when Mobius is really good, what it's doing is just cutting off a bunch of decks that otherwise are already pretty bad. It's making them even worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And that is generally like a reasonable critique of the card, I think. Mobius's biggest issue is that when he is good, or when you want to be playing him, you still need an additional hook. My hope is that Pixie can provide that additional hook. That is a good thing for the metagame as a whole. I do wonder if maybe it's just not necessarily worth going for, because, like, again, Pixie goes with Mobius. They are a package. They go together. That's what you do. You do Pixie Mob. And every time I've played Pixie, it's been because I wanted to play Mob. And I think that that is good, and raising the floor is good, but I honestly do think that because it's such a self-solving problem, they maybe could have been more generous here. Last up, Ghost Rider is getting a point of power, and while I have been extremely verbose about all the other stuff in this patch because all of it gets my brain juices flowing, this one kind of doesn't get my brain juices flowing. It's just like, oh yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, Ghost Rider 4-5, sure, yeah, I'm with it. Now it matches the first Ghost Rider. We got a theme going on. They're both 5 power. It's great. This is a timely buff, right? People are going to be messing around with Khonshu stuff, various ways of trying to make sure their opponents, like, and they, maybe some symmetrical Moon Knight discards. Who knows? But I'm excited to see what a 4-5 Ghost Rider can do, even though I expect that most of what a 4-5 Ghost Rider can do is what a 4-4 Ghost Rider can do. This is actually a pretty small buff, relatively speaking, because Ghost Rider, yeah, it's a 4-4, but it's usually like, the point of the card is like it's a 4-4 that brings back like a 6-12, so it's really like a 4-16 going to 4-17. It's like, I don't really feel like that's going to matter too much. But it does make him a mildly less embarrassing card for you to just play for stats on his own. It's a soft Iron Patriot buff, I guess. And we have now the ability to, like, look at this card and be like, all right, you know, it's a little more reasonable for me to try to do this stuff. I'm now no longer going to get so blown out if I hit my fail case. It's a 4-5 instead of a 4-4. 4-4 is really embarrassing. 4-5 is still kind of embarrassing, but it's not like, oh my god, it's the end of the world. I am totally owned. So, yeah. good buff. I feel like there's a kind of a bunch of cards where it's just like, you could slap a point of power on these, and Ghost Rider is definitely one of them, and I'm glad they slapped a point of power on him. I have a fear with this patch, which is that it will meaningfully address the power levels of Iron Patriot and Galacta, but it will not meaningfully address their play rates, because I think they go from being like the second best thing at their cost or the best thing at their cost to the second best thing at the cost or the best thing at the cost. I already thought Iron Patriot was worse than Sam Wilson. Now I definitely do, but I definitely did before. Galacta might still be the best 4. I think that this is probably good, though. Like, this is like, okay, we are now lowering the overall power level of the game. Like, that's legitimately probably a good thing to do. We're taking the game and we're saying, like, hey, look, these cards have such a delta between them and the next best stuff to be doing that we think we can just tone it down a little, and there will not be a major play rate drop-off. And I'm pretty sure that's true. But what I'm worried about is that people will see the lack of a major play rate drop-off and be like, this patch didn't do anything! And I think that's just going to be untrue. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if the cards were still both extremely good. Elite, maybe the best. That means that the patch was good, because they are now worse cards in an objective sense. They didn't get better with this patch, they got worse. And so if they're still really good, what that means is that Second Dinner is fulfilling their promises of not bait and switching people with these season pass cards. What I'm trying to say is that you can either argue, wow, Second Dinner bait and switched me and then nerfed this card, or wow, this patch did nothing, but you can't do both. And I expect that I'm going to see a lot of both at some point. So I just want to keep you intellectually honest if you can. If I can, because I do expect that I'm going to see a lot of complaining about those two things from both directions. And honestly, to me, I feel like that means this is probably a pretty smart thing to do. I'm very excited about the Sauron thing. I want to explore Surtur there. I'm very surprised that they were like, you know, let's nerf Surtur like 15 times in a row and then give it a Sauron hook. Like, okay, I guess. I really am excited for that one. That is like a change that I doubt is going to be super impactful, but I really want to matter. And of course, as always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Let me know what you think in the comments, unless it's, wow, how did he talk for 25 minutes about 5 cards? You know how I did that. I'm a yapper. Have a good one, y'all.